that suggested she'd been preparing this confrontation for days. She was wearing her usual uniform, pressed khakis that looked like they had been ironed with military precision, a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, and that expression that said she was about to make someone's day significantly worse. Her graying hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that made her face look even more severe. She was carrying a clipboard, because of course she was carrying a clipboard. "Excuse me," she shouted, while still 20 feet away, pointing directly at Jake, like she was identifying a suspect in a lineup. "You cannot rent to random people. This is a family neighborhood with strict regulations about occupancy and tenant screening." Jake froze with a box of vinyl records in his hands, looking completely bewildered by this sudden assault from a woman he'd never seen before in his life. The poor kid had probably been expecting to quietly move back home and figure out his next steps without attracting any attention.
They won't do that,
Instead,
Frizo.
he was being confronted by what appeared to be the neighborhood's self-appointed sheriff. I quickly stepped outside, already feeling my blood pressure starting to rise, mentally preparing myself for what was clearly going to be an unpleasant conversation. "Karen, this is my son," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, despite the fact that she was essentially accusing me of running some kind of illegal boarding house operation. "He's moving back home for a while to figure out his next steps." But Karen wasn't having any of my reasonable explanation, because reason wasn't really what she was interested in. "Impossible," she declared with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in her entire life. "I know the HOA rules inside and out, and they clearly state that adults over 18 cannot live with their parents for more than 30 days without proper documentation board approval, and a formal review of the impact on neighborhood character." She was citing some bylaw that I was pretty sure she'd either made up on the spot or seriously misinterpreted, but she delivered it with such conviction that even I started to doubt whether I understood the rules of my own neighborhood. The woman had a gift for making you feel like you were breaking some fundamental law just by existing in your own space. A small crowd was starting to gather, because nothing draws neighbors like the promise of drama unfolding in real time. And I could see people emerging from their houses with that particular look of curiosity mixed with concern that suggested they weren't sure whether to intervene or just enjoy the show. Jake looked absolutely mortified, like he wanted to pack everything back into his car and drive to another state where nobody knew about HOA regulations or neighborhood character assessments. "Look, Karen," I said, pulling out my phone with exaggerated patience. "I can show you his birth card, his driver's license, and any other documentation you might need to verify that this is definitely my son and this is definitely his home." But Karen was building up steam now, her voice getting higher and more strident with each word she spoke, like she was a tea kettle approaching full boil. "I don't care about birth certificates or family relationships," she announced loud enough for the entire street to hear. "The rules clearly state that any adult children returning home must file a change of occupancy form with the Architectural Review Committee at least 14 days in advance. Plus, I can see musical equipment being unloaded, which means potential noise violations, disruption of neighborhood tranquility, and possible impact on property values." She gestured dramatically at Jake's guitar cases like they were evidence of some serious crime. "This is exactly the kind of thing that destroyed property values in my old neighborhood. Young adults moving in without proper oversight, bringing their chaotic lifestyles and their complete disregard for community standards." The way she said young adults made it sound like Jake was part of some dangerous demographic that posed a threat to civilization itself. I lost $30,000 because people thought they could just ignore proper procedures and do whatever they wanted, and her voice was getting shrill enough that dogs in other yards were starting to take notice. "I will not let that happen here." That's when Elena appeared on our front porch, and the entire dynamic of the situation changed in ways that I didn't fully understand at the time. My wife stepped outside with that particular kind of calm that I'd learned to recognize over our 20 years of marriage, though I'd never really thought about what it reminded me of until that moment. It wasn't the calm of someone who was relaxed or carefree. It was the calm of someone who was completely in control of herself and fully aware of everything happening around her. Elena's posture was perfectly straight, her shoulders back in a way that suggested military training or professional discipline, and she surveyed the scene with the kind of methodical attention that most people reserve for emergencies or crisis situations. She took in Karen's aggressive stance, the gathering crowd of neighbors, Jake's obvious distress, and my own growing frustration. processing all of it in about 3 seconds before making her move. Karen paused mid-sentence, clearly sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the confrontation, though she probably couldn't have articulated exactly what had changed. "Ma'am," Elena said, her voice level, professional, in a way that was completely different from how she usually talked around the house. "Would you like to see the documentation proving this is our son? I can show you his birth certificate, school records, proof of residence, and other paperwork to express your concerns about occupancy regulations." The way she spoke was formal, but not hostile, precise, but not cold, like she was reading from some kind of official protocol that she knew by heart. There was something in her tone that suggested she understood exactly what rules and procedures Karen was trying to cite, and that she was prepared to address each concern with appropriate documentation and proper channels. Karen's eyes narrowed as she picked up on the change in Elena's speech patterns, clearly recognizing that this wasn't the response she'd been expecting, from what she probably assumed was just another suburban housewife. "And who exactly are you?" Karen demanded, her voice on a suspicious edge that suggested she thought she might be dealing with someone who actually knew what they were talking about. "I'm Elena Dave's wife and Jake's mother," Elena replied simply, but there was something in the way she said it that conveyed much more information than just those basic facts. "I believe there may be some confusion about the HOA regulations you're citing, and I'd be happy to review the actual bylaws with you to clarify any misunderstandings." The offer sounded reasonable and helpful, but there was an undercurrent of quiet confidence that made Karen take a small step backward, like she was beginning to realize that this conversation wasn't going to go the way she planned. But what exactly did Elena know, and why was she so calm about Karen's threats?
Being in online school has definitely changed our daily structure. So much more relaxed. And now that
Type. Yes, if you think Elena has a secret. The next morning, I was barely through my first cup of coffee when I noticed Karen standing at her living room window with a pair of binoculars that looked like they belonged to a serious bird watcher, or possibly a private investigator. She wasn't even attempting to be subtle about her surveillance operation, just standing there in full view of anyone who cared to look, tracking every movement in and around our house, like she was conducting some kind of scientific study on the habits of the Martinez family. The woman had clearly decided that if she couldn't immediately get rid of Jake through official HOA channels, she was going to gather evidence to support whatever case she was building against us. Jake came downstairs around 10 o'clock, moving with the kind of careful quiet that suggested he was hoping to avoid any additional confrontations with our neighbor. He looked like he'd slept about 3 hours, which was probably accurate, given that he had spent half the night unpacking, and the other half worrying about what Karen might do next. "Dad, that lady is seriously watching our house," he said, glancing nervously toward Karen's window as he poured himself a bowl of cereal. "It's like she thinks I'm going to rob a bank or something. This is really creepy." I followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was Karen with her binoculars trained directly on our kitchen window, apparently fascinated by Jake's breakfast routine. "Just ignore her," I said, though I was starting to feel pretty unsettled myself by the intensity of Karen's attention. She'll get bored eventually and find something else to focus on. But as the morning progressed, it became increasingly clear that Karen was not going to get bored, and she definitely wasn't going to find something else to focus on. Every time Jake went outside to get something from his car to sit on the front porch, his coffee to take out the trash to check the mail, Karen was there with her binoculars and her notebook, documenting everything with the dedication of a researcher, studying a particularly interesting species of wildlife. She was recording what time he left the house, what time he came back, what he was carrying, what he was wearing, who he talked to, and probably what he had for lunch. By noon, I was starting to wonder if Karen had any other responsibilities in her life, or if monitoring our family had become her full-time occupation. The level of attention she was paying to Jake's completely normal activities was starting to feel less like neighborhood vigilance, and more like something that might require legal intervention. I decided to do a little investigating of my own, pulling up county records online to learn more about Karen's background, driving this obsessive behavior. What I found was pretty revealing about Karen's motivations and psychological state. Karen Blackwell had indeed lost a significant amount of money on her previous house, but it wasn't just because of college kids moving in next door like she'd claimed. The whole market in that area had crashed after a major employer relocated, leaving Karen stuck with a mortgage that was worth more than her house. She'd been forced to
Are you getting SSDI or disability benefits right now? You should listen closely to this message. People who get
Fake HOA cops threatened to seize a veteran service dog right off the trail. Their ringleader, Trent Carlisle, wore fake badges and preyed on the vulnerable with smug authority. But Jordan had one card they didn't see coming. His sister-in-law is a Superior Court judge. And just wait until you hear how she turned their fake power into real criminal charges. Jordan Hill had walked this trail 100 times, a quiet loop around the neighborhood retention pond, shaded by sycamores and dotted with benches. It was his daily escape, a routine that kept his nerves steady. And Max, his golden retriever, padded faithfully at his side, alert and calm, trained to detect his neurological episodes before they happened. But that morning, routine cracked like glass. 3 men stepped out from between 2 parked golf carts near the trailhead. They wore matching black polos, each stitched with a makeshift badge reading HOA Compliance Division in blocky gold thread. One had mirrored sunglasses. Another wore tactical gloves. The third, tall, square-jawed and overconfident, had a walkie clipped to his belt and a retractable baton in full view. Jordan slowed. Max immediately positioned himself between his handler and the strangers, posture stiffening like he could sense the shift in energy. "You can't walk that animal here," the tall man barked, stepping forward. "This area is HOA controlled. No unregistered dogs allowed." Jordan blinked, confused. He's a service dog. He's registered at the state and federal level. That vest he's wearing isn't for show. Another man pointed at Max's tag and scoffed. "That doesn't count. This is private property. We enforce higher standards." Jordan kept his tone steady, but his heart had already picked up pace. "I'm a veteran. I have epilepsy. He's not a pet. He's medical equipment. You can't legally restrict access to a trained service dog." The third man stepped in now, gripping something holstered on his belt. A stun device, or what looked like one. He tilted his head. "Then you better have a lawyer on call, because if you don't remove the mutt, we'll have to seize him for noncompliance." The air left Jordan's lungs. For a half second, he forgot how to breathe. His hand reflexively curled around Max's harness, not just for support, but protection. Max didn't growl, didn't flinch. He was trained for moments like this, even if Jordan wasn't. What hit hardest wasn't just the threat. It was the performance. The badges, the gear, the way they carried themselves, barking commands like they were federal agents. It looked official. It felt official. But deep down, Jordan knew these weren't real officers. They were pretending. And yet, in that moment, they held all the power. And they were threatening to take away the one thing standing between him and a seizure on cold concrete. For the first time since he came home from the army, Jordan felt the old panic start to crawl up the back of his neck. Not from war, from home, from people pretending they had authority, and using it to scare those who couldn't afford to push back. And if they thought he'd roll over like everyone else, they were about to learn who Max really protected. The man's name was Trent Carlisle, and in Jordan's eyes, he didn't just represent the worst kind of bully. He embodied it. Trent wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't licensed security. He wasn't even a contractor with credentials. But he wore a badge. He barked orders. And worst of all, people listened because they were scared. He and his little crew rolled around the neighborhood in a white SUV with flashing lights and magnets slapped on the side that read HOA Patrol Compliance Division. They wore black polos embroidered with fake insignia, utility belts loaded with imitation gear, and printed citation slips that mimicked real municipal forms. The entire act was built to confuse, intimidate, and force residents to obey, even when they had no legal authority whatsoever. Trent thrived on it. His confidence wasn't rooted in power. It came from performance. He had failed the police exam twice a decade ago, bounced between jobs, and then somehow wormed his way through a part-time HOA maintenance role. From there, he inflated his presence, gave himself a title, and convinced a few naive board members that he could keep things orderly if given freedom to act. They gave it to him.
he took more. Jordan heard the stories in hushed voices, over back fences and folded arms at mailboxes. "They fined me for parking in my own driveway," said a single mother on Elmwood Drive. "He called my cane a trip hazard and said I'd be written up," muttered Mr. Chen, a Vietnam-era veteran. But nothing hit harder than Ruth's quiet words one afternoon as she watched Jordan pass her porch with Max. "They came to measure my ramp," she whispered, voice trembling. "Told me it ruined the curb appeal. Said they'd cut it if I didn't have a variance." Jordan stood still, heart burning in his chest. Ruth used that ramp to get to her dialysis man twice a week. Without it, she was trapped. It was never about compliance. It was control, power, taken piece by piece from the people least able to fight back. And it didn't stop there. One neighbor's autistic son had a therapy pony, a gift from a local support foundation. Trent threatened to report the family for keeping livestock and showed up during a birthday party, clipboard in hand, demanding the animal be removed for safety concerns. Parents cried. Kids watched. No one stopped him. Until Max. The confrontation at the pond was the line in the sand. A medically certified service dog, clearly vested, accompanied by a veteran. And still, Trent acted like he could detain the animal on the spot. Jordan had enough. He drove straight to the local precinct and filed a formal complaint, laying out every detail. The uniforms, the threats, the impersonation. The desk officer skimmed the report, barely looked up. "Sounds like an HOA issue," he said, lips curling in practiced dismissal. "We don't really get involved in those." That sentence, short, tired, and lazy, hit like a slap. But Jordan didn't walk away in defeat. He walked away focused. If the badge on the wall wouldn't help, he'd reach for the bench. Because Jordan Hill wasn't just a veteran with a service dog. He was also family to someone the HOA patrol would have never dared to cross if they'd only known. Jordan didn't have to beg for help. He just had to tell the truth. And tell it to the right person. That person was his sister-in-law, Judge Danielle Marcus, seated on the County Superior Court bench for over a decade. Known for her calm, deliberate rulings and zero tolerance for abuses of power, Danielle was respected across the legal community. But this wasn't about court schedules or procedure. This was about family. About families. About a line being crossed on the mother-in-law's front lawn. And Jordan recounted everything. The uniforms, the fake citations, the stun device aimed at Max. Danielle didn't interrupt. She didn't offer hollow sympathy. She simply went silent. Then she turned, picked up her office phone, and began issuing commands. Not suggestions. Directives. Within hours, she had assembled a legal team and opened a formal file. By the next day, an emergency injunction was filed in county court. It barred any unlicensed individuals from conducting compliance patrols or presenting themselves as authority figures within the HOA's boundaries. But that was just step one. Judge Danielle ordered a full judicial review of the HOA's private security contract. And what they uncovered shook even her experienced courtroom staff. Trent Carlisle and his so-called officers weren't licensed at all. Their private security certifications had expired 5 years earlier and had never been renewed. Worse still, they had submitted forged paperwork to the HOA, pretending to work through a legitimate company, a company that had no record of ever hiring them. The contract they waved around? A PDF stitched together from a free template website. Danielle's legal clerks kept digging. And what they found next turned quiet outrage into cold fury. Internal HOA emails revealed board members had not only been aware of Trent's tactics, they'd encouraged them. One email read, "If residents won't listen, Trent's group can apply pressure. A little fear goes a long way." Another, "We don't need permits. Just get uniforms and be firm. Perception is 90% of compliance." That was enough. By the end of the week, uniformed county sheriffs, real officers, arrived at the HOA office. Trent and his crew were ordered to surrender their badges, gear, and identification under suspicion of criminal impersonation, fraudulent contracting, and intimidation under false authority. Residents watched from their porches, as the same men who had bullied and barked orders were now being escorted, silent and red-faced, off the property by legitimate law enforcement.
Bucky below!
Say a word. Max sat beside him on the porch, head tilted, as if sensing the shift in energy. But Danielle wasn't finished. She wasn't just protecting her family. She was setting a precedent. And the HOA board was about to learn what happened when a court of law turned its full attention on a petty system built on fear. It didn't take long for the consequences to catch up. By formal order of the county licensing, Trent Carlisle and every member of his so-called compliance team were stripped of all business. Their names were entered into the state's fraud prevention registry, flagged for impersonation and operating under false authority. The HOA's existing contract, already questionable, was declared null and void. In its place, the court appointed an independent, vetted compliance officer with a single mandate: protect residents, not control them. But for Jordan Hill, the real moment of justice wasn't in a file or ruling. It came at the next HOA general meeting, now open to residents and overseen by a county liaison. This time, no bluffed badges, no veiled threats, only accountability. The room was packed. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now sat upright. Some took notes. Others brought printed copies of old complaints that were never addressed. And seated near the front, with quiet, watchful poise, sat Judge Danielle Marcus, still in her robes. Jordan sat beside her. Max lay curled at his feet, calm as ever, vest secured, eyes gentle but alert. Then Trent was called forward. Not in uniform, just a man in a collared shirt, stripped of pretense. His posture wasn't arrogant anymore. It was careful. Danielle stood. No gavel, no raised voice, just a courtroom presence that silenced the room. She looked directly at Trent and spoke with clarity, each word deliberate. You threatened a medically certified service dog under the color of law. You misrepresented yourself, manipulated others, and instilled fear in residents who trusted you. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not a policy issue. That's a crime. Trent said nothing. His attorney gently placed a hand on his arm, not to comfort, but to remind him to stay seated. Danielle turned to Rare Tsaruk with the crowd. Let this serve as notice, she said, scanning every face, that fear in uniform without lawful authority is not compliance. It is coercion, and this county will not tolerate it. Applause didn't erupt. It rose. Slow at first, then stronger. People didn't cheer like a victory. They clapped like a breath finally released after being held too long. Later that evening, Jordan received 2 letters. The first was a formal apology from the HOA, signed by every board member. The second came from the county commission, expressing regret for the delay in intervention and confirming new oversight moving forward. Jordan read both and folded them neatly and tucked them away. He didn't need validation. He didn't need revenge. What he needed, and what he got, was safety, dignity, and the restoration of a community that now stood with him. As for Max, he simply lay by the fire that night, one paw over the other, tail flicking softly against the floor. He didn't know about lawsuits or legal codes, but he knew his human was safe, and this time no one would ever come between them again. Jason McMillan's therapy dog was falsely labeled a dangerous wolf by his HOA president, Claire Rutledge, triggering threats of federal action. Claire's crusade wasn't about safety. It was a personal vendetta to force a veteran out of her pristine neighborhood. But Jason had a powerful move. Federal law and expert proof were on his side. And just wait until you hear how this battle ended, with justice served in the most public way. When Jason McMillan adopted Daisy, he believed he was finally turning a page. After 3 deployments as a combat medic in Afghanistan, Jason had been carrying wounds no doctor could stitch, memories that came in waves, panic that struck without warning. Daisy, a large Alaskan Malamute mix with soft eyes and an even softer temperament, had been trained by a therapy program that matched rescue dogs with veterans. For Jason, she was more than a pet. She was the reason he could step outside each day. Maple Ridge Estates looked like the perfect place to start over. A clean, quiet suburban neighborhood tucked into the Carolina foothills, neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and cheerful porch swings. On move-in day, Jason noticed the HOA sign near the entrance, preserving the safety and beauty of our community. It sounded reassuring, even welcoming. For the first few months, life was uneventful in the best way. Jason and Daisy developed a routine. Morning walks, afternoons at the dog-friendly park, peaceful evenings in their small backyard. Neighbors seemed friendly enough, though a few glanced uncertainly at Daisy's size when they passed. Jason shrugged it off. People sometimes mistook big northern breeds for something more intimidating. It wasn't the first time. But 3 months in, that easy peace shattered. It was a crisp Saturday morning. Jason returned from the grocery store, balancing a bag of supplies and a coffee, when a flash of bright color caught his eye. An orange paper was taped crookedly to his front door. The bold black headline hit him like the punch. Notice of violation. Wildlife possession infraction. Unlawful harboring of a wolf. He froze. For a moment, his mind refused to process it. Wolf? His eyes scanned the rest of the notice, heart racing. Per Commute 17B. Immediate removal required. Non-compliance will result in enforcement 1. He rushed inside and knelt beside Daisy, who thumped her tail lazily on the floor, entirely unaware of the storm about to break. Grabbing his phone, Association, said Claire Rutledge. Jason took a breath. This is Jason McMillan, Lot 27. I just found a notice on my door about my dog. Oh, yes, Mr. McMillan, Claire interrupted smoothly. We've had multiple complaints. Several board members have personally observed a wolf on your property. For the safety of the community, you must remove the animal by Friday. Jason blinked. Ma'am, that's not a wolf. She's a registered therapy dog, Alaskan Malamute mix, adopted from Carolina Veterans Rescue. Okay. There was a pause. Then Claire spoke again, voice cool as glass. I'm afraid the board has already made its determination. You'll need to comply. The call ended before Jason could protest further. He sat there, stunned, the phone still in his hand. This wasn't some confused neighbor. The HOA president herself was pushing this false claim and threatening federal action. That night, Jason barely slept. His mind raced with questions. How could anyone believe Daisy was a wolf? Why were they targeting him? What if officials actually got involved? But by morning, the nightmare deepened. The next blow landed less than 24 hours after the notice. Jason was preparing Daisy's breakfast when a knock rattled the front door, loud, deliberate. Peering through the peephole, he saw 2 unfamiliar men in dark uniforms with bright compliance officer patches sewn on their chests. Cameras dangled from their necks, clipboards in hand. Jason opened the door just a crack. One of the men smirked. We're here to document the illegal wolf on your property, he said, as if reading from a script. Jason's pulse spiked. She's not a wolf. You're not stepping inside. The second man, expressionless, began taking photos through the door frame. Fuming, Jason slammed the door shut and treated curtains. Through a narrow gap, he watched as the pair paced his front yard, snapping pictures of Daisy, who now stood quietly behind the window, her head tilted in confusion. They stayed 15 minutes before leaving, but Jason knew this wasn't over. By late afternoon, the real damage began. His phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor. You need to check the HOA group, now. Jason's stomach dropped as he opened the Maple Ridge Estates Facebook page. The top post, authored by none other than Claire Rutledge, read in bold letters, Community Safety. Alert unlicensed wolf confirmed on Maple Lane. After extensive review and multiple expert identifications, your HOA is taking action to protect the safety of children and pets. We urge all residents To remain alert and avoid the vicinity of Lot 27.
In a controversial new bill that just passed aimed at making America healthy again, all 50 states.
To remain alert and avoid the vicinity of Lot 27. Underneath, the photos taken that morning had already been uploaded. Daisy's image frozen mid-yawn, her thick fur catching the sunlight. The captions read, "Dangerous predator loose on Maple Lane. And why is this allowed in our neighborhood?" Jason's heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He scrolled through hundreds of comments. Some neighbors asked reasonable questions, but many bought into the hysteria, calling for Daisy to be removed or worse. When Jason took Daisy for her usual walk that evening, the change was